introducing Margot Lee Shetterly. She's a writer who grew up in Hampton, Virginia, where she knew many of the women in Hidden Figures. She's an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Fellow and the recipient of a Virginia Foundation of Humanities grant for her research into history of women in computing. She lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and you can visit her on her website at margotleeshetterly.com. And I thank you for sharing the day with us and coming.
So one of the things that's been amazing to me, since beginning the research and writing for Hidden Figures, is how many amazing connections there have been. And I just met Dorothy Vaughn's great grandniece, and now, there, yes. This is, so, I just want to say, and I was just, it has been amazing for me to meet the families of the women who I wrote about in this book. Obviously the main principal characters, Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, but also the other women. There are a lot of women doing this work, and I've met many of those women. I've met their families. I've met the engineers who worked with them and had the highest respect for them. And so I'm just so grateful for the connections that the story has brought me. So wonderful meeting you, and I look forward to staying in touch. So as you may know, my book, Hidden Figures, tells the story of Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, who are 4 Black women who spent their careers working as professional mathematicians at NASA. At a time when Blacks were legally segregated from whites in all aspects of life, from the schoolyard to the graveyard, and when women of all backgrounds were unable to get a credit card in their own names, and many states were not eligible to serve on juries, these women of Hidden Figures upend all of our notions of what it means to be Black, to be female, to be a scientist, and to be American. Dorothy Vaughan was a math teacher at the segregated Black high school in Farmville, Virginia, and you may recall that Farmville, Virginia, during last year's election cycle, that is where the vice presidential debate was held. She was a math teacher at Farmville, Virginia, in the high school there, when she traveled to Hampton, Virginia in 1943 to take a job at what was then called the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, which is the kernel of what would become NASA. She had to sit at the back of the bus to make that trip, but she would go on to become the first Black manager at what was one of the world's most exclusive engineering organizations. In the 1950s, Mary Jackson had to apply for special permission just to walk through the doors after hours at all-white Hampton High School so that she could take advanced math courses as part of an engineering training program. She went on to become NASA's first Black female engineer, and she very well may have been the first Black woman aeronautical engineer in the entire United States. You know, Katherine Johnson, she will turn 99 years old in August. And what you may have seen that this past weekend, 2 days ago, she delivered the commencement address at Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia, on front. It's a spectacular, amazing woman. She was born in 1918. Statistically at birth, a Black baby girl born that year had a 2% chance of finishing high school. Of course, Katherine, who's from rural White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, she went on to calculate the trajectories for the orbital space flight of astronaut John Glenn, which is a moment that tipped the balance in the favor of the United States in the space race with the Soviet Union. And Dr. Christine Darden, she is not in the movie, she is in the book. She was still in college when the women who were portrayed in the movie, the older women, were doing their work. And in fact, she went to school with my mother and Dorothy Vaughn's children and Katherine Johnson's children. But she was still a student at an all-Black junior high school in rural North Carolina, a school that had no science lab, it had secondhand textbooks only, when the Supreme Court passed the Brown versus Board of Education decision outlawing racial segregation in public schools. 2 decades later, as a young aeronautical engineer at Langley, Dr. Darden wrote a computer program that set the industry standard for sonic boom minimization, and she went on to become one of NASA's leading experts on that topic. These women's lives intersected many of the signature moments of what we call the American century. So why has it taken us decades to tell their story? The first 5 Black women started working at the Langley Laboratory in 1943, and I believe that when we count all 10 of the NASA centers from 1943 through 1980, there may have been as many as 80 Black women working as computers, mathematicians, engineers, and scientists. And what is just as remarkable is that this group of Black women was part of a cohort of female mathematicians of all backgrounds that when we started in 1935 grew to be several hundred strong, perhaps more than 1,000 women. So 1,000 women getting up and going to work every day for decades at NASA. Again, why didn't we turn these women into professional role models and use them to pull generations of young people, particularly young women, into science careers? And that is the question that I receive more than any other when I talk about this story. So the answer to the question has to be more than just the fact that the work they did was often classified, as it was during World War II and the Cold War, though that is certainly a part of it. Loose lips sink ships. I'm sure we remember that phrase. That was the watchword back in those days. And the women knew, everyone who worked at that installation knew better than to come home or discuss their work with anybody who wasn't a work colleague. Now, the most blatant of the reasons is the physical separation of the workplace itself. So the Black women were less visible because they worked in a segregated office apart from the white women. They were forced to use colored bathrooms. They ate at the colored table in the lunchroom. And the women knew that they had to come to work dressed to the nines so that they would not be mistaken for a cafeteria worker or perhaps for the cleaning lady. So if today's America gets a case of double vision when trying to focus its gaze on a Black female mathematician or scientist, just imagine the blind spot that these women existed in 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. Furthermore, women of all backgrounds were separated from the men. In the beginning, the Black women went into the West area computing office, and the white women went into the East area computing office. And all of the women had a difficult time breaking out of the pools and getting plum assignments as members of an engineering team. The fact is, for decades, computing was considered women's work. And I have to tell you that what I truly believe now is that the story of technological advance in the 20th century is the story of women sitting in offices and doing math. That was true for Hidden Figures. There are 2 excellent books on female computers. One that's called The Glass Universe, about the women at the Harvard Astronomical Laboratory. There's one called Rise of the Rocket Girls that talks about the women who worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is now part of NASA. And I just finished reading a book called The Idea Factory, which is it's the history of Bell Labs, which is, you may know, basically became AT&T and invented what we know as the communications industry. So in the second chapter, and this is after having done, all of this research on and understanding how these engineering teams work, there's one little line that says something about, and it's basically focusing on these, these towering male engineers. There's one little line talking about the engineers and the women who worked with them. And what I know now, having done the research for Hidden Figures, is that there is no place where you have that kind of colossal technological advance where you don't have rooms full of women doing math. So the story of the 20th century, one of the great underreported stories of the 20th century, is that technological progress comes from women sitting in rooms doing math. So the thing is, though, for decades, computing was women's work, even though it was invisible. So the men were the engineers, the women were the mathematicians. The men did the manly analytical work, and the women did the rote computing. This is the way their job was seen. Most of these women, regardless of their race, were hired as sub-professionals. That was literally a federal sort of a category. SP meant sub-professionals. So that put them above the clerical employees in the organization's hierarchy, but it put them around below the men, who were generally hired in as engineers, and that included the black men who began to be hired at the laboratory in the 1950s. Even when the women went on to do the same work as the men, the sub-professional grade meant that they were paid less than the men. So growing up in Hampton, Virginia, I had the good fortune to see black or female mathematicians, scientists, and engineers as normal people. For me, they were as normal as the teachers and the librarians, the bus drivers, the lawyers, construction workers, the military people who lived in my community. There was no cognitive dissonance for me when I heard the words black, female, and scientist and realized that they applied to one person, not three different people. And yet, even I have to admit that despite the fact that I grew up around these women, it took the better part of my adult life to see them as they deserve to be seen and to ask questions about their careers, to value their contributions to my community, to science, and to our society. I was living next door to these women, and for years they existed in my blind spot as well. So perhaps a more relevant question than why haven't we heard this story before today is, why does this story have so much resonance for us right now? I've spent a lot of time thinking about it because it has been clear in the time since the book was published in September and since the movie has come out, that Hidden Figures seems to be the right story at the right time. And I think it's because finally our eyes are sharp enough to truly see the women and their accomplishments and to recognize that their contributions altered the course of American history. Now, there's an aspect to the hidden status of these women that I actually think of as something of a silver lining, and that is the fact that this is a story about a group of women. So these women were part of a vibrant community, and they were part of a workplace that employed other people like them. We love the first and only stories, and this does not fit that mold. Though these women were exceptional, none of them had to be the exception, either the first and the only black woman or the first and the only woman. They're like what I like to call extraordinary, ordinary people. These are hardworking achievers who were nonetheless very unassuming and low-key about their work. If you heard about the excellent things that they were doing, you probably did not hear it from them firsthand. So since the book and the movie have come out, I've spent a lot of time in Hampton, Virginia, where I grew up, where these women lived for many years. And I cannot tell you the number of conversations that I've had with people who come up to me and say, well, I knew Mrs. Vaughn. I lived down the street from her for 30 years. Or I sang in the church choir with Katherine Johnson every single Sunday, and I knew that they worked at NASA. But I had no idea that they were working on orbital trajectories, you know? I mean, people are absolutely amazed what these women were doing, that it, you know, the facts of which we're discussing now, but which these women themselves never talked about. Everyone knew them as the Girl Scout leader, or the thoughtful neighbor, the person they saw at church on Sunday, members of sororities or the PTA. These women were part of their communities. They never stood apart from it. And if that's one of the reasons why we haven't heard more about them to this point, it's also one of the reasons why I think they are the perfect role models, because somehow they managed to balance all of their identities with their souls intact, to paraphrase Nina Simone. What they show us is that there's talent all around us if we just know where to look. They illustrate the benefits of opening the door of opportunity to all of our citizens. And it also shows how high the stakes can be when we fail in that mission. So our job, your job, my job, all of our jobs, is to open our eyes and to recognize the power in the extraordinary, ordinary people that we encounter every single day. As a society, I think we are still looking past the women, particularly the women of color who are working in STEM fields. This Einstein archetype is such a stubborn thing, and there is no doubt that it contributes to the difficulty that we still have in filling that particular pipeline. But once we have trained ourselves to see people like the ones that I wrote about, past and present as well, to see these people and to value what they've accomplished, our next obligation is to tell their stories. Human beings are a storytelling species. It is what transmits our culture and our values, and it determines both the meaning of our future and our past. So, although it's taken a long time for the story of hidden figures to be told, it is never too late for a good story. These stories, well told, never lose the ability to change the way others see us, and more importantly, how we see ourselves. And I think the power of the American Dream is that it too is a story. It's as much myth as it is reality. It's something that we tell ourselves about how we live and what we believe and what we think is possible. It was very important to me that the American Dream be a part of the subtitle of the book, because Hidden Figures is a story about including Black women in the American Dream. The protagonists are Black women, and writing about women like me, describing them in the way that I want to be seen, the way all of us want to be seen, as a three-dimensional, fully realized, normal person. That produced the book that, in many ways, I've been waiting to read since I learned how to read. When I was 9 years old, I went to my parents and I told them that I decided that what I wanted to do was to move to New York and to work on Wall Street, which is something that I eventually did after I graduated from college. So you can imagine my parents were torn between being really excited that they had this precocious daughter and wanting to conduct an exorcism. But I had been influenced by what is still one of my favorite books, The Westing Game by Evan Raskin. So I saw myself in protagonist Turtle Wexler, the book's 13-year-old stock market whiz. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I went to the library and I checked out a stack of books on the stock market. So the librarian, she charged all of the books to my card, but when she was done, she looked me in the eye, and I'll never forget this. She looked me in the eye and she said in this very patronizing voice, "Sometimes other people ask us to check out books for them, but we should never, ever do that." So, as you can imagine, I was mortified. I mean, I was so embarrassed and just mortified, like I'd done something wrong. That's how it felt. But I hope that this book means that if the next curious little kid, whoever they might be, whose dreams and talents, for whatever reason, far exceed the low expectations of the rest of us, the next time that person moves forward to give full rein to their curiosity, the people who receive them will have eyes sharp enough not to see them just as they are, but as they might be. There are a lot of moving and exciting scenes in the Hidden Figures movie, but perhaps the most galvanizing for me is one of the first scenes and the simplest, and that is when the young Katherine Johnson, the actress playing Katherine Johnson, who is a little Black girl with big glasses, just like I was, is just standing at a blackboard factoring quadratic equations. And yet, though Hidden Figures has particular resonance for Black women, it is unquestionable that this story is a broader story that is relevant to women of all backgrounds who are struggling to narrow the gap between their abilities and their ambitions and society's perceptions of them. In January, I attended the Joint Mathematics meetings in Atlanta. So this is the largest conference in the world of mathematicians, like 6,000 mathematicians in 2 conference hotels. And it was amazing, so much fun conference. Despite what people think about mathematicians, they're actually a lot of fun. So, but one of the attendees, who is a white woman from rural North Carolina, she's the dean of an engineering school down there, she came up to me and she said how much Dorothy Vaughn's struggle reminded her not just of her own struggle, but of her mother's struggle. So her mother had been someone who was very gifted in math, but had come from the rural mountains of North Carolina and was never able to get past being seen as the mountain girl that everyone else saw her as. And I have had people from all backgrounds, men who are the fathers of daughters in engineering programs, men who are struggling to get through engineering programs themselves, who find inspiration in these women, space geeks who've told me, I don't think I would have ever picked up a book that had to do, or that, you know, dealt with these social issues, but the space angle gave me a way through the door, and I'm really grateful for the history that I learned because of that. I have also been absolutely amazed at the impact that this story has had on young people. So I get a steady stream of communications from kids and from parents, from kids who are working on National History Day, who are interested in you know, getting more information about these women. You know, at events, I get to talk to a lot of young people. I get emails, Twitter. You know, so much on social media. So one woman wrote me on Twitter, and she told me that she had a very math-phobic fourth grade daughter. Who just, you know, could not, for whatever reason, wasn't particularly bad at math, but sort of had this idea of herself as being very bad at math. And she read the book, the Young Reader's Edition, she saw the movie, and then she had a math test. And what she said to her mother is, the numbers are going into my head just like Dorothy Vaughan. Which I was like, this is, you know, that is amazing. There was another book signing that I went to a couple of months ago, and there was a little blonde boy, 9 years old. He's like a baby John Glenn. He was there with his mother, and he brought me this oversized cutout paper doll. So this was an exercise that he had to do in his classroom. What they had to do was to cut out these paper dolls and then write on them the facts of the life of a famous American that they had selected. So he selected Katherine Johnson, and he told me that he wanted to be like her when he grew up. And he'd actually made 2 of these Katherine Johnson cutout dolls. One was for his classroom, and one he gave to me, which of course is framed in my house right now. So beautiful. It's tempting to slot the story of Hidden Figures into the category of Black history or women's history. Of course, we celebrate Black History Month in February, we celebrate Women's History Month in March, and we see these as distinct history celebrations, even though many African Americans are women and many women are African American. We tend to see Black history and women's history and even science history as somehow removed from what we have in mind when we talk about American history or World War II history or space history. But the truth is, Black history is also the history of World War II. Aviation history cannot be told in full without talking about the contribution of women. Virginia history is incomplete without the story of massive resistance to desegregation in my home state's public schools, but it also can't be told without telling the great adventure involved in fulfilling humanity's tremendous desire to fly. So for me, researching and writing this book, it taught me more than I ever could have learned in a history PhD program. I had to look beyond everything that I'd ever been taught in school and re-examine what I thought I knew about the civil rights movement, or about the space race, or about the history of women in mathematics and engineering, about my hometown, Hampton, Virginia. I had to take all of the pieces that I had always been taught were discrete moments or movements and look for the connections, always holding these women at the center of my frame of vision. And what I learned, and what I think that people, particularly kids, are responding to, is that math and science talent knows no gender, race, or economic status. That people of different backgrounds can come together to achieve great things. That nonfiction can be as compelling or more compelling than any novel, and that Black history or women's history or science history is American history with a capital H. The Black women at the heart of Hidden Figures fought to dismantle the barriers that they faced due to their race or their gender or both. But what's also true is they confronted the kinds of things that are familiar to us all. The search for meaningful work, the fight to provide a better future for our families, the restlessness of personal ambition, fear of the unknown, fear of the other, the struggle to define what it means to be successful and to define what it means to be American. I believe that this is a quintessentially American story with all of the dreams and the dilemmas that come with it. And I also believe that these women and their stories are providing us something that we've always yearned for, but maybe we are yearning for more than ever, and that is evidence of the triumph of curiosity and imagination over fear. Thank you very much.